If you ever drove down Willow Lane on a late autumn day, you'd pass a white house with peeling shutters and a hand-painted swing dangling from an old oak tree. That was my home, a place that looked warm and welcoming from the outside. But inside it was a stage where every member of my family played their assigned part. My mother, Linda, took pride in her garden and in the neatness of her kitchen. My father, Robert, was the sort of man who ironed his own shirts and never missed a city council meeting. And then there was my little brother, Tyler, the golden child, a natural athlete with a smile that could soften even the iciest neighbor. If you looked closely, you'd notice the way my parents' eyes followed Tyler around the yard, the way his soccer trophies lined the mantelpiece, each one dusted and gleaming. I learned young that love in our house was measured in applause. When Tyler won his first Little League game, the whole family celebrated with pizza and streamers. My perfect score on the regional science test got me a nod and a new set of highlighters for my homework. No one ever meant to be cruel. They simply noticed what was loudest and brightest. It's a pattern I've since realized is common in so many American families. Love gets tangled up with achievement, and some children learn to shine while others learn to disappear. I became the helper, the quiet one, the child who set the table and faded into the background, always useful but never quite dazzling. Looking back, I remember moments that might have seemed small to anyone else, but to me, they were tectonic shifts. In 5th grade, I spent weeks building a model of the Mississippi River for the school science fair. I mapped the tributaries, made tiny paddle boats from balsa wood, and even programmed a blinking LED to mimic flooding patterns. The day of the fair, my parents had to attend Tyler's basketball tournament, and I stood beside my project shaking hands with judges and other parents. I won first prize. I walked home alone in the drizzle, my ribbon tucked into my pocket, rehearsing how I would describe the moment at dinner. But that night, the conversation circled around Tyler's game-winning shot, and my river became just another shadow in the room. At the time, I didn't know there was a name for this, a kind of invisible child syndrome. Psychologists say that when a family values performance and tradition above all, some children learn to keep their hopes and victories small to avoid rocking the boat. I only understood this years later when I met other women who'd grown up the same way, learning to find their value in service, never in the spotlight. Sometimes the wounds we carry from childhood aren't sharp and obvious. They're slow growing like vines wrapping around your dreams until you hardly notice they're there. What struck me as I got older was how these patterns seeped into every corner of my life. In high school, I chose extracurriculars that fit around my brother's schedule so someone could always give him a ride home. I learned to cook, to clean, to listen, to say yes, more often than I meant it. Teachers described me as responsible, a quiet leader, which is really just another way of saying invisible. At night when I finished my homework, I'd sit on the old swing out back and look up at the stars, wondering what it would feel like if someone saw me as the center of their universe just once. It wasn't all sadness, of course. There were golden evenings, too, when Mom and I baked bread together or when Dad let me help plant tulip bulbs in the spring. But even those moments came with an undercurrent reminders to keep my head down, to let Tyler take the lead, to value family harmony above my own ambitions. "Don't make a fuss, Madison," my mother would whisper, smoothing my hair before a school event. "Let your brother have his moment." Sometimes I caught myself rooting for him just as hard as everyone else, hoping that if he shone bright enough, there would be light left over for me. I started to notice the same patterns in families around me. My best friend Jasmine, whose father worked long hours as a nurse, learned to celebrate her report cards, quietly saving her biggest smiles for her younger siblings' piano recitals. Another girl on my debate team confessed that she never told her parents about her victories because they're already so proud of my brother. It was the silent code we all follow: don't upset the balance. Don't ask for too much. Don't outshine the golden child. It's a lesson American families rarely talk about, but quietly passed down generation to generation. As I grew, I realized this pattern wasn't just about favoritism. It was about the roles we're assigned and the dreams we're allowed to have. Tyler was the achiever. I was the caretaker. He got the spotlight. I got the safety net. In families like mine, the fear of disappointing those you love can be so much heavier than the fear of failing yourself. I saw it in the way my parents avoided difficult conversations, in the way I always said I'm fine, even when I wasn't, in the way our lives moved forward on rails someone else had built. Years later, when I started reading about family dynamics in psychology books, I learned how common these wounds are and how often they go unhealed. I read about invisible daughters who became invisible women, always holding space for everyone else's dreams, but never speaking their own aloud. I saw myself in those stories, and I wondered how many of us walk through life, carrying the weight of the roles we never chose. I even found a study from a university in Michigan about how quiet achievers often become the backbone of organizations, quietly holding up the world while others get the credit. It comforted me a little to know I wasn't alone. If there's one lesson I took from those early years, it's this: what's invisible isn't unimportant. Sometimes the ones who go unnoticed are the ones who understand the world's pain most deeply. Our empathy, our patience, our ability to listen and lift others up, those are real strengths, even if they don't come with ribbons or applause. But the danger I would come to learn is in forgetting that your own dreams deserve space too. There are gifts in growing up invisible, but there are dangers as well. The gift is learning how to care, to sense the needs of others, to find meaning in kindness. The danger is that you can lose sight of yourself in the process. I carried this duality with me, compassion and caution, love and longing, into every stage of my life. And as I look back now, I see that everything that came next, the safe choices, the silent suffering, the eventual breaking point, were rooted in these early lessons. If you've ever felt like the supporting character in your own family story, know this: you're not alone and your story is not over. Sometimes the greatest change begins with a single quiet question. What do I really want? That question would take years for me to ask and even longer to answer, but every journey begins somewhere. For me, it began under that old oak tree in the shadow of my brother's trophies, dreaming of a life where my victories might one day matter too. And so, as I grew and watched my brother's star rise ever higher, I quietly charted a different path, one paved with silent hopes and hidden plans. It would take time, heartbreak, and more than a little courage to step off the stage my family built for me. But deep down, I always knew one day I would have to find my own light. As the seasons changed and my brother's achievements continued to fill our home, the seeds of my own ambition began to sprout quietly at first, but growing stronger each year. What happened next would challenge everything I'd been taught about safety, success, and who gets to write the story of a family. Because sometimes the only way to find yourself is to risk everything you thought you needed to keep the peace. If you'd asked me at 17 what my future looked like, I would have shown you a brochure for Brown University, one of those glossy admissions packets my mother saved in a drawer next to Tyler's sports medals. My parents believed in education the way some families believe in religion. A good degree is a ticket to freedom, my father used to say, and for a while I believed him. So when the acceptance letter came in the mail, everyone acted like it was a foregone conclusion. There was never a discussion about what I truly wanted: art school in California maybe, or studying marine biology out west. The path was laid out, paved, with good intentions and silent compromise. My first year at Brown, I tried to fit in with the kids who wore pressed shirts and carried ambition like a family crest. I chose economics as my major, not because it thrilled me, but because it sounded responsible. I watched my classmates talk about internships on Wall Street, but all I really wanted was to sign up for a creative writing workshop or spend my weekends volunteering at the animal shelter. Instead, I stacked my schedule with statistics, finance, and business law. Every phone call home was an update about credits, grades, and future prospects. "We're so proud of you," Mom would say. "Your father tells everyone his daughter is going to be a financial analyst." I smiled, but inside I felt more like a passenger than a driver. It wasn't just my family. In college, I met dozens of students walking similar paths, children of immigrants determined to make it, the eldest daughters carrying the dreams of a whole household, quiet boys who traded art for accounting out of loyalty to their parents. I remember one late-night conversation with my friend Daniel, whose real passion was composing music, but whose father had already lined up an internship at a major consulting firm. "It's just easier this way," Daniel sighed, staring at the ceiling of our dorm lounge. "I'll get through school, get a job, maybe. After that, I'll figure out what I really want." I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to admit. The culture around me only reinforced the message: play it safe. I saw it everywhere, from career fairs pushing future-proof industries to professors who praised risk-takers in theory, but advised caution in practice. No one talked about uncertainty as a space for growth. Instead, uncertainty was the enemy, something to be managed, minimized, or better yet, avoided altogether. I found myself measuring my worth in GPA points and extracurriculars, ticking off each requirement like a to-do list for a life I hadn't chosen. After graduation, I did what I thought I was supposed to do. I accepted a job offer at a prestigious consulting firm in Chicago, a place where the elevators smelled of cologne and every meeting started with firm handshakes and careful small talk. My parents were ecstatic. Tyler bragged about me to his friends. I moved into a tiny apartment with a doorman and bought my first grown-up suit. On the outside, I was a success story, the poster child for playing by the rules. But inside, something felt wrong. I started each morning in a fog, riding the train downtown with hundreds of other professionals, all of us dressed in muted colors and carrying the same insulated coffee mugs. The work was demanding but predictable. PowerPoint presentations, client calls, late nights fixing slide decks, while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. My team was filled with bright, hardworking people, but most of us seemed to be living on autopilot. We compared step counts, meal prepped on Sundays, and counted down the days to long weekends. In rare, quiet moments, I'd catch my reflection in the office windows. Hair pulled back, makeup, perfect eyes, just a little too tired for 24. "You're doing amazing," my manager said after my first big project, sliding a bonus check across the table. "Keep it up, Madison. You're on the fast track." I should have felt proud. Instead, I felt small. That's the trouble with the safe path. It gives you everything you're supposed to want, but it rarely asks what you truly need. I started noticing tiny cracks in my well-planned life. On lunch breaks, I found myself wandering into bookstores, running my fingers over poetry collections or sketching city skylines in the margins of my work planner. I'd stay late at the office not to work, but to avoid the empty silence of my apartment. The highlight of my week was the hour I spent volunteering at a local animal rescue, scrubbing kennels and sneaking treats to anxious dogs. For 60 minutes, no one expected anything from me but kindness. One Saturday, while visiting home, I watched my parents beam as Tyler announced he'd been accepted to medical school. The whole family cheered, and for a moment, the old ache returned, an echo of those childhood nights spent clapping for someone else's success. Later, my mother found me sitting alone in the backyard, lost in thought. "You're so lucky, Madison," she whispered, mistaking my silence for contentment. "You have everything a young woman could want." I wanted to tell her that luck had nothing to do with it, that I'd built my life brick by brick out of duty and fear. But I smiled and squeezed her hand, keeping the peace the way I always had. I wasn't the only one struggling. Over coffee with Jasmine, I confessed my growing restlessness, expecting her to be surprised. Instead, she laughed. "Madison, nobody really knows what they're doing," she said. "Most of us are just following a script and hoping we don't forget our lines." That conversation stayed with me for weeks, echoing every time I hesitated at a crossroads. I realized how many people were stuck in lives they'd outgrown, afraid to leap into the unknown. Looking back, I see how easy it is to mistake comfort for happiness. There's a difference, though, a deep, resounding difference. Comfort is predictable. It's what keeps us in the jobs, relationships, and cities that don't feed our souls. Happiness, on the other hand, is unruly. It requires us to risk disappointment, to ask difficult questions, to admit when something no longer fits. I started journaling again, writing late into the night about dreams I hadn't dared speak aloud in years. I made lists of things I wanted to try: painting, traveling, maybe even starting something of my own one day. The small lesson I took from those years is one I wish someone had told me sooner. Sometimes the safest path is the one that slowly erodes your sense of self. Playing it safe can be its own kind of risk. The risk of losing who you are beneath the weight of who you're expected to be. I think so many Americans raised on stories of upward mobility and achievement fall into this trap. We become experts at climbing ladders only to realize too late that the ladder is leaning against the wrong wall. By my third year at the firm, the questions I'd tried to quiet for so long grew too loud to ignore. I watched colleagues burn out, leave for startups, or pivot to teaching yoga in far-off states. I envied their bravery, but also feared the uncertainty that followed them. But as each season passed, my own longing for something different began to outshine my need to be good in my family's eyes. I wanted more than checklists and annual reviews. I wanted meaning, adventure, and the chance to create something that belonged to me. And so, in the spring of my 26th year, I found myself standing at a crossroads, not just of career, but of identity. I could keep moving along the safe, familiar road, or I could step into the wild unknown. The decision would require everything I'd learned about courage and about the price of peace. What happened next was the moment my real story began. It's funny how a breaking point rarely announces itself with thunder. For me, it arrived on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. The sky over Chicago was a patchwork of gray and gold, the city humming with its usual anonymous energy. I sat at my desk staring at a spreadsheet, my eyes tracing numbers I'd stopped caring about months before. My manager stopped by, her arms full of reports, and offered a tight smile. "Big client review next week. You'll lead, right?" I nodded, because that's what I always did, even as something inside me sagged with exhaustion. When she walked away, I opened my drawer, pulled out the letter of resignation I'd drafted and rewritten a dozen times, and pressed it flat on my lap. Most people think the hardest part of leaving is the logistics, health insurance, savings, LinkedIn status. For me, it was the voice in my head echoing my family's questions. What will people say? What about stability? Isn't this what you wanted? I'd grown up in a home where quitting wasn't an option. My father, who had never taken a sick day, believed perseverance was the answer to every problem. My mother, who kept her disappointments folded up like old receipts, taught me to endure. So that afternoon, as I typed out my official notice and hit send, it felt less like a career move and more like betraying the very people who'd raised me. That evening, I called home to share my news. I'd rehearsed a dozen versions of the conversation, hoping for support, or at least curiosity. Instead, the phone line went silent, the kind of silence that hums with unspoken fear. My father's voice was tight, holding back disapproval. "Is this really necessary, Madison? You have a good job. People would give anything for your position." My mother asked quietly, "Are you sure you're not just tired? You could take a vacation, try again." I tried to explain the restless ache, the sense of living a life that wasn't mine, the longing to build something with my own hands. But every answer sounded selfish, and I heard myself apologizing for wanting more. That's the thing about family love, can sometimes sound like doubt. After the call, I walked the city for hours, letting the wind clear my head. I wandered past art galleries I'd never had time to visit, stood outside coffee shops where people scribbled in notebooks and looked perfectly content. I wondered if they'd ever had to choose between their own dreams and someone else's peace of mind. Eventually, I found myself on a bench near the lake, staring at the dark water. In that moment, for the first time, I let myself imagine what life could look like if I made choices just for me. It was terrifying and electric. Not everyone can afford to take that leap. I was lucky enough to have a small safety net, some savings, a cheap apartment, a friend willing to help me brainstorm what came next. I remember a late-night conversation with Jasmine, who poured 2 cups of tea and listened as I mapped out every possible failure. "You'll land on your feet, Maddie," she said, eyes kind but clear. "You've been building bridges for everyone else your whole life. Maybe it's time to build one for yourself." That was the moment I realized support doesn't always come from the people you expect. Sometimes it finds you when you finally speak your truth. I started researching writing and dreaming, sometimes in a burst, sometimes in fits and starts. My mentor, Dr. Hayes, an old professor from Brown, replied to my nervous email with a simple note. "Congratulations on choosing courage. What's the worst that could happen? Now what's the best?" Those words became my mantra as I navigated the months that followed. Messy, unpredictable, but finally my own. I took freelance gigs, lived on boxed pasta, and poured my energy into learning coding, pitching, connecting with others who'd also stepped off the expected path. If there's one lesson that emerged from that tumultuous spring, it's that real growth begins where certainty ends. Our culture often celebrates those who have it all figured out. But the truth is, most breakthroughs are born from confusion and risk. I met countless people in coffee shops and co-working spaces who had also leapt, some soaring, some stumbling, all braver than they realized. We became each other's safety net, trading job leads, book recommendations, and hard-won advice. That first act of defiance, handing in my resignation, didn't change everything overnight, but it did break a spell. I started to see possibilities I'd ignored for years. I learned to live with the discomfort of not knowing what came next, to trust my instincts, and to find hope in small wins, a project completed, a new friend made a day when I woke up excited to work again. I learned to forgive myself for wanting more than what was offered, to honor the quiet voice that insisted there was another way. What surprised me most was the way courage compounded. Every small risk made the next one easier. Every honest conversation brought me closer to the life I wanted. I realized that the first act of saying no to what wasn't right created space for bigger, bolder yeses. It was no longer about running from something, but running toward the person I hoped to become. As the city bloomed into summer and the world seemed to stretch open with possibility, I felt the first real sparks of excitement in years. My old life was behind me, but the road ahead was still a mystery. I didn't have a clear plan, just a stubborn hope and the beginnings of an idea. It was time to leave the safety of what I'd known and step into the wild unknown, ready to face the failures, small wins, and the battles that come with building something from scratch. Moving out of my safe, predictable life felt like stepping into an uncharted forest. There was no roadmap, no clear trail, only the quiet hush of possibility and the stubborn, echoing doubt that followed me everywhere. I left my polished high-rise apartment in downtown Chicago for a cramped studio on the edges of Boston, where the rent was cheap and the floors creaked with every step. My parents called the new place character building, a gentle way to say they worried I was building nothing at all. I unpacked my boxes in silence, taping old photographs and post-it notes on the faded walls, trying to make the space feel like a beginning rather than a retreat. The truth is, starting over isn't glamorous. It's a series of awkward firsts: your first solo grocery trip on a tight budget, your first cold shower, because the landlord still hasn't fixed the heater, your first night, wondering if you've made an irreversible mistake. I woke up some mornings with a knot in my stomach, the anxiety of what-ifs heavy on my chest. But there were also moments of strange delight: a sunbeam through my window on a rainy day, the freedom of scheduling my own hours, the simple satisfaction of doing something just for myself. It was in these little pockets of quiet that I found my courage taking root. I launched my first project, an adaptive learning platform called Clarke Adaptive AI, out of a makeshift office wedged between my bed and a rickety bookshelf. My resources were laughable: a laptop that sometimes overheated, a secondhand printer, and a collection of sticky notes mapping out grand plans. I coded for hours, alternating between confidence and fear, watching online tutorials and reading every startup failure story I could find. My savings dwindled faster than I'd hoped, and for a while, takeout coffee became a luxury I couldn't afford. I worked odd jobs, tutoring, copywriting, even pet sitting to keep the lights on. But every time I watched my code run smoothly, even for a minute, I felt a flicker of pride. Failure, I quickly learned, is the unspoken tuition fee of entrepreneurship. My first pitch to a local angel investor was a disaster. My slides froze. My words tangled and the questions came sharp and fast. Do you have any proof of concept? Who's your competition? Why should we believe in you? I left the meeting sweating, embarrassed, and fighting back tears. Later, Jasmine found me on a park bench, my laptop bag at my feet, and listened as I recounted every awkward detail. Everyone fails, Maddie, she reminded me, but not everyone tries again. That night, I updated my pitch deck, rewrote my business plan, and promised myself I'd get back in the room. The startup world was both exhilarating and unforgiving. I read stories about founders who'd been rejected 100 times before landing their first investment: Sarah Blakely, Brian Chesky, even Steve Jobs. I took comfort in their persistence, scribbling their names on my whiteboard as a reminder that greatness often grows from 1,000 tiny losses. I attended networking events sometimes as the only woman in the room, and learned to introduce myself with a firmer handshake. Some nights I'd pace my apartment, rehearsing my story, willing myself to sound like I belonged, even when I wasn't sure. One turning point came after months of rejection. I won a small grant from a local innovation hub, not enough to fund my dream, but enough to hire a freelance developer for a month. Together, we fixed bugs, launched a basic demo, and got our first handful of users. 3 teachers from a Boston charter school, willing to pilot my adaptive learning app in their classrooms. Seeing students interact with something I'd built was a thrill no paycheck could ever match. Their feedback was honest sometimes, painfully so, but every critique helped me improve. I started to see the project as a living thing, growing stronger with every mistake and correction. Of course, isolation was a constant companion. Most days, my only conversations were with my computer or the barista at the corner cafe. I missed family dinners, lazy weekends with old friends, the sense of certainty that came from fitting in. Sometimes my parents would call, voices tinged with concern, asking if I was eating enough or if I needed help with rent. Their questions were loving, but their worry felt heavy, a reminder that they didn't quite understand this new life I'd chosen. Still, I learned to find connection in unexpected places: a Slack channel for women in tech, a mentor who offered tough love, the shared laughter of a team brought together by hope rather than history. I realized that small wins matter more than we think. The first paying customer, the first positive review, The day I solved a problem that had stumped me for weeks. Each little victory stitched a bit of confidence back into the fabric of my self-belief. I started celebrating the process rather than just the outcome. One foot in front of the other, Dr. Hayes would write in her encouraging emails, and don't forget to look up every once in a while. It was simple advice, but it carried me through many uncertain days. If there's a lesson in those early years, it's this: you don't need a grand plan to start. You only need the willingness to keep moving, even if it's just one tiny step at a time. So many Americans see stories of overnight success and think, that's how real life works. The truth is, most journeys are made up of setbacks, pivots, and the grit to keep going. The wilderness isn't a punishment. It's where you learn how resourceful, resilient, and brave you really are. With every mistake and every small win, my confidence grew. The isolation began to feel less like exile and more like incubation, a space where I could dream, build, and become something new. My story was still unfolding, but I finally felt like I was writing it myself. The path ahead was still foggy, but it was mine, and for the first time in years, I was excited to see where it might lead. As autumn painted the city in gold and red, I realized that the greatest battles weren't against failure, but against being unseen. The next chapter would challenge me to step out of the shadows, not just as a founder, but as a woman daring to be heard in a world that too often looked the other way. What came next would test my strength in ways I'd never imagined. Some struggles in business are easy to spot: long hours, tight budgets, tough competition. But some are quieter, threading through daily life like invisible wires. For me, the hardest battles were the ones no one else seemed to notice. They started the moment I tried to pitch my startup idea outside the safety of my apartment and stepped into rooms where I was often the only woman and always the youngest. I'll never forget my first big tech networking event. My hands shook as I pinned my name badge to my blazer, heart pounding, as I walked into a room full of confident, fast-talking founders. The men clustered together, laughing about venture rounds and golf outings, tossing jargon like confetti. When I finally worked up the courage to introduce myself, the first question wasn't about my product or my vision. Instead, it was, "Are you with the marketing team?" Another investor smiled and said, "It's nice to see more women supporting tech these days." I wanted to tell him I was the CEO, the one who'd coded every line and planned every feature, but my voice felt small. And so for the first time in a long while, I let the moment pass. As the months went on, the pattern continued. I'd pitch to investors and watch their attention flicker as soon as they heard my age or saw my face. "Is there someone else on your team with a technical background?" One asked, not realizing I'd built the prototype myself. Another older investor suggested I find a more experienced male co-founder to help with the heavy lifting. At first, I laughed these comments off, telling Jasmine and Dr. Hayes about them over coffee, but deep down, they stung. I started second-guessing my decisions, wondering if my ideas were as solid as I'd believed. These moments weren't isolated. Studies show that less than 2% of venture capital in the US goes to women-founded startups, and the number drops even lower for women of color. When I read those statistics, I felt a strange mix of anger and validation. It wasn't just me, the deck really was stacked. And yet every time I heard another no, every time a meeting ended with polite indifference or subtle condescension, I felt the urge to work harder to prove myself, to keep going, until I couldn't be ignored. Still, the self-doubt crept in at night. There were evenings I stared at my computer, the code blurring into meaningless symbols, and wondered if everyone was right. Maybe I wasn't cut out for this. Maybe I'd bitten off more than I could chew. I remembered all the times in childhood when my voice was the quietest in the room, when being the good girl meant staying out of the way. Had I really changed, or was I just pretending? One story sticks out in my mind. I was pitching at a regional innovation contest, one of those events with judges in suits and an audience full of hopefuls. I'd practiced my pitch until I could say it in my sleep. But when I stepped onto the stage, one of the judges interrupted with a smile. "You remind me of my daughter. She's very organized, too." The crowd chuckled and I laughed along, but something shifted inside me. That night, I rewrote my pitch to start with my credentials, my years of technical experience, and my vision, not just the product. The next time I took the stage, I made sure the first words out of my mouth were, "I'm Madison Clarke, founder, engineer, and CEO." Gradually, I found other women who understood. We met in cramped coffee shops, over late-night Slack chats, in corners of conferences, where we could vent and strategize without judgment. We shared stories about being talked over, about ideas borrowed by louder voices, about the exhaustion of having to prove ourselves twice as hard for half the credit. These friendships became my support system, my invisible board of directors, as Jasmine called it. I also began to recognize that my empathy, my ability to listen and adapt, wasn't a weakness, but a strength. While some founders bulldozed ahead, I learned to build partnerships to nurture my team, to listen deeply to users, and make fast, thoughtful changes. My company grew slowly, but with every iteration, it became stronger and more resilient. The teachers using my platform sent feedback that helped shape the product in ways I could never have imagined on my own. I stopped apologizing for not fitting the mold and started carving out a new one. If there's a lesson in these unseen battles, it's that the world may not always be fair, but you don't have to play by its narrow rules. The path for a woman in tech, especially a young one, will always have obstacles. But every time you refuse to shrink, every time you claim your title and your vision, you make the path wider for the next person. My mentor, Dr. Hayes, reminded me, Madison, you can't wait for permission to lead. Sometimes you just lead and let the world catch up. Looking back, I realized that the battles I fought in silence were as formative as the wins I celebrated publicly. They taught me resilience, clarity, and the power of finding your own voice even when it shakes. I wasn't invisible after all. I was simply standing on ground that hadn't yet been seen. With every hard conversation, every setback and small win, I grew stronger in my role as a founder and as a woman determined to build something that mattered. But the greatest transformation was yet to come. It was time to step out from behind the curtain completely, to take everything I had learned and use it not just to survive, but to build something that would thrive in full view of the world. There comes a time in every founder's journey when you realize that sometimes the world isn't ready to see what you're building. I learned this lesson not just from personal rejection, but from watching others' friends whose ideas were laughed off before they even left the napkin stage mentors who warned me about building in silence. After months of doors closing and introductions going nowhere, I decided that maybe the best way to grow wasn't to shout about my dreams, but to protect them until they were strong enough to stand on their own. That's when Clarke Adaptive AI went underground. Instead of seeking the spotlight, I poured my energy into creating a product that would speak for itself. I focused on finding a handful of true believers teachers who cared less about branding and more about what the technology could do for their students. Developers who knew what it meant to chase something bigger than themselves. My tiny team met in borrowed spaces and late-night video calls, each of us carrying our own stories of being overlooked and underestimated. I found there was power in stealth. We didn't waste time on glossy press releases or flashy events. Instead, we honed our core features, making the platform more responsive, easier to use, and smarter with every update. The feedback from our pilot schools was sometimes brutal, but always honest. One teacher, Mrs. Ramirez, called our early interface clunky but promising, and her insights led to one of our biggest breakthroughs in classroom usability. We measured progress not by social media mentions, but by the smiles of students who finally felt seen by their lessons. Of course, there were days when it felt like we were working in the shadows for nothing. Investors passed because we were too quiet. Partners hesitated because we didn't have a track record. I watched startups with bigger budgets and louder voices land features in TechCrunch and EdSurge while we quietly iterated, fixing bugs and chasing grants. At night, self-doubt would whisper, "If no one knows you exist, do you really matter?" But then a teacher would send a message describing a struggling student who'd found new confidence using our tools, and suddenly the silence felt sacred, not empty. Looking for inspiration, I read stories of other startups that had thrived under the radar. Stripe, Clubhouse, even Slack had started as private experiments before breaking into the mainstream. I learned the difference between visibility and value. The former can be fleeting, the latter is built brick by brick. I stopped worrying about how we looked and focused on what we were actually doing. Our stealth mode became less about hiding and more about growing, protecting our work, so it could become undeniable before the world had a chance to tear it down. Our team became a little family united by a sense of shared purpose and a refusal to play by anyone else's rules. We cheered each other's victories, commiserated over setbacks, and built a culture where no idea was too small and no question too dumb. When a developer named Priya joined us, she brought along her own experience of being dismissed in corporate tech. Her fresh eyes and relentless optimism kept us honest and hopeful. We don't need 1,000 fans, she'd remind us during late-night debugging sessions. We just need to change one life at a time. With every sprint, our platform became more robust and user-friendly. We began to attract attention not from the media, but from those who mattered most: educators, parents, and the kids themselves. I'll never forget the email from a principal in rural Vermont who wrote, "Your software finally made math click for my most stubborn student." You have no idea what that means to us. It wasn't a headline, but it was real impact, and it made all the difference. If there's a lesson in building quietly, it's that patience is as important as passion. The world often rewards what's loud and fast, but real innovation grows in the space between the spotlight and the shadows. I learned to trust the timing of my journey, to keep faith in the work, even when no one else was watching. For every overnight success story, there are 100 long, lonely grinds that came before it. Hours, months, even years of unseen effort. Eventually, the silence began to work in our favor. By the time a local education foundation reached out about a grant, we had more than a pitch, we had data testimonials, and a working product that could prove itself in real classrooms. Our story was no longer about potential, it was about results. When we finally invited outside eyes to look at what we'd built, their skepticism turned to surprise, then excitement. We weren't just another idea. We were solving real problems in ways no one else had tried. My parents, still unsure of what I actually did, all day visited one afternoon at my tiny office. I showed them the feedback from students and the quiet emails from grateful teachers. For the first time, I saw a different kind of pride in their eyes. Not for my salary or my title, but for the change I was making in the world, one small victory at a time. My mother squeezed my hand, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "Maybe it was good you waited to share this. Sometimes the best things grow in silence." If I could offer advice to anyone building a dream, it's this: don't measure your progress by how loud your journey looks to others. Measure it by the lives you touch, by the resilience you build, and by the joy you feel, even on the hard days. There is a power in patience and a wisdom in waiting. The world will see you in its own time. Your job is to keep building until your work is too strong to be ignored. As momentum quietly gathered and our team's confidence grew, I sensed a new season on the horizon. The years of stealth had strengthened us, but the time was coming to step out into the light, to claim our place in the larger story of education and technology. The world would soon know who we were, but first I had to find the courage to let my work and myself be seen not just by strangers, but by everyone who had ever doubted, dismissed, or simply overlooked what I was capable of becoming. There is a strange kind of courage that comes from building quietly for so long that when the world finally looks your way, you're not desperate for approval, you're ready for it. For me, that moment arrived like sunrise after years of dusk, gentle at first, then suddenly blinding. It started with an email from a local education journalist who'd heard about the success stories at one of our pilot schools. I almost didn't respond, worried about jinxing the slow, steady growth we'd worked so hard for. But Priya nudged me. "Madison, it's time people knew what we've done. We owe it to the students." Soon, one article turned into 3 and then a small spot on a local radio show. At first, I found myself apologizing for how simple our story seemed. No celebrity investors, no viral launch, just teachers' kids and code. But to my surprise, that's exactly what people wanted to hear. Reporters asked about our hardest days and what it felt like to be a woman founder in a field where so few look like me. I answered honestly about the doubts, the lessons, and the pride in making something real. The response was overwhelming. Parents emailed, teachers called, and for the first time, I realized our journey might inspire more than just our users. The biggest turning point came with an invitation to speak at a regional education summit. I'd stood in front of classrooms and investors before, but this was different. 1,000 people, bright lights and cameras. I wrote my speech a dozen times, rewriting every story and statistic, wanting so badly to get it right. The night before, I barely slept, imagining every possible failure. Jasmine sent me a text, "Tell your truth. That's all anyone needs to hear." The next morning, I took the stage, my hands only trembling a little. I spoke about building in the shadows, about believing in students that others had written off, about the power of a single teacher's hope. When I finished, the room was silent for a heartbeat and then erupted in applause. After the summit, things changed quickly. Our inbox filled with inquiries from school districts, nonprofit organizations, and even journalists from national magazines. One day, I got a message from Forbes requesting an interview for their Next Generation Founders issue. My heart pounded as I answered questions about our early failures, our team's quiet victories, and what it meant to lead as a young woman in tech. The article, published a month later, didn't just tell my story, it highlighted every team member and student who'd shaped our journey. My parents read it front to back with tears in their eyes. "We're so proud of you," my father said, voice rougher than usual, not just for the success, but for the way you've made it matter. It wasn't just family who noticed. Old friends from school reached out, some with congratulations, others with regret for not seeing my drive earlier. A former classmate wrote, "I always thought you were quiet. Turns out you were just busy building something incredible." I felt a gentle satisfaction, not of revenge, but of validation. The people who once overlooked me were now listening, eager to understand what it takes to create something from nothing. Even Tyler, my brother, sent a note, simple but heartfelt. "You did it, Mads. I'm proud to be your brother." What surprised me most was how many others were waiting for someone like them to step forward. At each event or interview, young women would come up to me, sometimes with tears in their eyes, and whisper that my story made them believe they could try too. I realized that the biggest impact we make is often through the risks we take and the truths we share, not just the products we build. One high schooler emailed, "I showed your article to my mom. She finally understands why I want to study engineering." That message stayed with me for weeks. Maybe the courage to be seen after years of hiding is contagious. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's that the world can change its mind in an instant, but only if you keep showing up as your true self. Sometimes, you have to outlast the doubts, not just your own, but everyone else's too. The journey from unseen to undeniable is never simple, but it's worth every awkward pitch, every lonely night, every moment of self-doubt along the way. The applause, when it comes, is just the echo of all the silent work you did when nobody was watching. Our company began to grow in ways I'd never imagined. Partnerships with education nonprofits, offers from investors who once ignored my emails, invitations to collaborate on research projects. Suddenly, I found myself in meetings with people who had once doubted I even belonged at the table. But now, they listened closely, asked for advice, and trusted our team's insights. There was a delicious irony in it all, but also a quiet reminder. Respect is earned not just through achievement, but through integrity, persistence, and staying true to your values. Still, success brought new challenges. The pace quickened and the world's expectations pressed in. I had to learn to balance visibility with vulnerability to protect the culture we'd built while reaching for bigger impact. I leaned on my team, on Jasmine, on every lesson forged in the silent years. "Remember who you are," Dr. Hayes wrote to me after reading the Forbes article. "Let your light shine, but don't forget where you grew roots." As public recognition opened new doors, it also cast new shadows. Now the challenge was to keep our mission at the heart of our work, to protect what made us different, even as the world rushed to claim us as its own. The next chapter would test not just my leadership, but my ability to draw boundaries, to honor what truly mattered, even as the spotlight grew brighter than ever before. Success, as I discovered, changes the shape of old relationships. When the headlines faded and the rhythm of daily life resumed, my world felt both bigger and smaller than ever before. For all the strangers who now recognized my name, the hardest conversations were still waiting at home. My parents, proud but bewildered, tried their best to keep up, peppering me with questions about meetings and partnerships. Yet underneath their curiosity, I sensed something deeper, a worry that the daughter they raised had slipped out of reach. One Sunday afternoon, my mother invited me to dinner. "It'll just be us," she promised. I arrived to find her fussing with a tablecloth, her hands moving in anxious little circles. Dad was already seated, flipping through my latest press feature with a hesitant smile. Tyler, back from med school, joked about needing founder advice for a side project. The meal was pleasant enough: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, stories of the week, but I felt a current of tension running beneath the surface. Every time I answered a question, there was a pause, as if everyone was listening for a note that never quite arrived. After dessert, my father cleared his throat. "We're proud of you, Maddie," he said. "We just worry that all of this will take you too far from us." My mother nodded, her voice soft. "It's wonderful what you've built, but it's hard not always understanding where you fit now." Their honesty caught me off guard. For years, I'd longed for their recognition, but now I saw how much they longed for connection too. The roles had shifted, the parent seeking reassurance from the daughter. It's a common story I've learned for families to struggle with a child's unexpected success. Friends and colleagues shared similar tales of parents who celebrated achievements but quietly mourned the loss of the familiar. Jasmine described her own mother's confusion when Jasmine moved across the country for grad school, calling every week to ask when she was coming home. She's proud, but she misses the version of me she knew. Jasmine explained. I realized that my family wasn't alone in feeling left behind by change. We were all in our own ways learning how to let go of old roles. Setting boundaries with the people you love is one of the hardest lessons adulthood brings. After that dinner, I took a walk with my father. The evening was cool, leaves crunching underfoot. I began. Sometimes I feel like I'm always balancing two worlds, the person I am in the public eye and the girl who grew up on Willow Lane. Dad listened quietly, his usual advice withheld. I want to be close, I continued. But I also need you to respect how my life has changed. I can't share every detail and I can't always make space for everything you expect. But I do love you. That hasn't changed. He nodded, eyes damp. We just want to be part of it, Maddie. Whatever that looks like. The truth is, success can magnify misunderstandings as much as it erases old doubts. Tyler, for instance, saw my achievements as both a source of pride and an unspoken challenge. At first, he teased me about the Forbes article, making light of the attention. But beneath the jokes, I sensed a pressure, his own fears about living up to the family name. One evening, he confessed, "It's weird. For so long, I was the golden kid. Now I'm just the doctor. You're the one making headlines." We laughed, but the conversation left me thoughtful. In chasing my own dreams, I'd changed the shape of the stories my family told about themselves. With Jasmine, the dynamic shifted too. She became both confidant and sounding board, celebrating wins, but reminding me to keep my feet on the ground. Don't let anyone, family, or not define your worth by headlines or accomplishments, she warned. You're more than the world's expectations, Maddie. Don't lose the girl you were before all this. Her words anchored me, especially on days when the pressure threatened to sweep me away. Over time, I learned that boundaries are not walls. They're invitations for healthier connections. Instead of shutting my family out, I started inviting them to see my world firsthand, touring the office, meeting my team, watching a demo with students. My parents beamed with pride, and the mystery of my work faded into understanding. We found a new way to relate built on honesty and respect rather than duty or habit. If there's a lesson in these hard conversations, it's this: relationships change, and that's okay. Growing apart for a while doesn't mean love is lost. It means both sides are growing. The best gift you can give each other is permission to change, to grieve what's gone, and to celebrate what's new. For my family, that meant finding new rituals, Sunday dinners, yes, but also shared projects, little acts of support that made the distance feel smaller. The process wasn't perfect. There were awkward silences, misunderstandings, and the occasional argument. But every time we tried again, we grew a little closer. I started to appreciate not just who my family had been for me, but who I could be for them now. Someone willing to teach, to listen, to let go of the need for constant approval. The boundaries I drew weren't just for me. They allowed all of us to step into the next chapter together, less afraid of change. With a new sense of balance and a deeper appreciation for honest connection, I turned my attention to the broader circles of my life. The pressures of leadership, the sacrifices made along the way, and the friends who stood by me through it, all these would become the next lessons on my journey. I was beginning to see that true success was as much about the relationships you nurture as the goals you achieve, and the story was far from over. No one really warns you about the price of chasing your own dreams. The world likes to tell stories about triumph and glory, but rarely do we see the quieter costs, the late nights, the missed birthdays, the friendships that slowly fade as your calendar fills with meetings and deadlines. There were many evenings when the glow of my laptop was the only light in the room, when the city outside hummed with laughter and life, and I wondered if I'd traded too much for the privilege of building something of my own. Loneliness is a quiet companion in the lives of founders and dreamers. I felt it most acutely on weekends, scrolling through photos of old friends gathered for dinner or celebrating milestones I barely remembered to ask about. I kept telling myself it was just a season, that soon I'd have more time, but months slipped by and the gap only widened. Jasmine, always honest, once said, "Don't wait until the finish line to call your people back." Life isn't just about winning the race, it's about who's running beside you. Her words stung, but they were true. I realized I'd fallen into the trap of believing that success justified every sacrifice, even the ones that hurt the most. There were costs to my health too, stress-induced migraines, a restless mind that couldn't turn off even on supposed days, off the ever-present anxiety of what next. It's a common story in the startup world. I met other founders at networking events and co-working spaces who confessed to similar struggles, binging coffee, skipping meals, measuring their worth by productivity alone. One woman I admired, the CEO of a social impact startup, told me over lunch, "The hardest part isn't raising money or managing a team. It's forgiving yourself for being human." Her words echoed in my heart, a gentle reminder that achievement is only one part of a well-lived life. Still, in the midst of all the striving and solitude, there were small but powerful moments of connection. My team became a chosen family. Priya, with her relentless optimism, Javier, who brought humor to even the worst days, and Jasmine, who always made time to check in no matter how busy we both became. We learned to celebrate small victories together, a glowing review from a teacher, a bug finally squashed after days of work, the simple joy of sharing takeout in the office after a long week. These rituals, humble as they were, gave me strength and perspective. I realized that allies aren't just people who cheer you on from the sidelines, they're the ones who walk with you through every messy, beautiful step. I also started to see the importance of being vulnerable with those I trusted. There was a night when the pressure of a looming product launch nearly broke me. I called Jasmine in tears, expecting her to tell me to toughen up. Instead, she listened quietly, then simply said, "You don't have to carry this alone." That moment changed something in me. For all my efforts to prove myself strong and independent, the truth was I needed others, needed their kindness, their laughter, their faith in me, even when my own was running thin. If there's a lesson to draw from these sacrifices, it's this: ambition can be a lonely road, but it doesn't have to be walked alone. True allies make all the difference, not by rescuing you from the hard days, but by reminding you why the struggle matters. I learned to reach out to accept help and to let go of the myth that I had to have it all together. Life isn't meant to be a solo performance. The most meaningful successes are the ones we share. As the seasons changed and my company continued to grow, I found myself thinking less about what I'd given up and more about what I'd gained. Yes, I'd made sacrifices, time, comfort, certainty, but I'd also built something far richer, a circle of people who believed in the work and in me. Looking back, I understood that success isn't just about reaching a summit. It's about who's waiting at the top to share the view. With a deeper appreciation for the messy, beautiful web of connection and sacrifice, I began to reflect on what success truly meant. It was no longer about headlines or proving myself to others, but about finding peace with my journey and maybe inspiring others to find theirs. The final chapter of my story wasn't an ending, but a new beginning, and I was ready to share what I'd learned with the world. As the dust of achievement finally settled and life grew steadier, I realized that the summit I'd been climbing toward all these years was never really the destination. It was just one turning point in a much longer, richer story. I found myself drawn more and more to the world beyond the boardrooms and headlines, the classrooms, the local libraries, the places where big dreams are born quietly and without applause. It was in these quieter spaces that I saw the true ripple effect of my journey: young people, especially girls asking bigger questions, daring to imagine lives not limited by anyone else's script. One afternoon, our team organized Innovation Day at our Boston office. We opened our doors to students from schools across the city, letting them try our platform, tour the workspace, and meet the people behind the code. I watched as a group of middle school girls circled our developers, peppering them with questions about software creativity and how to bounce back from mistakes. Their curiosity was electric, their hope contagious. One girl lingered after everyone else had left, shyly asking, "Do you ever get scared?" I smiled, remembering all my old fears, and told her the truth all the time. But being scared just means you care about what comes next. As word of our work spread, we started collaborating with other organizations, nonprofits, city leaders, even national campaigns focused on equity in education. I was invited to share my story at conferences, community centers, and podcasts, each time finding new ways to talk about both failure and possibility. The questions from the audience always surprised me. Some wanted to know how to get started. Others wanted to know how to keep going when everything felt impossible. My answer each time was simple: surround yourself with people who see your worth, even on the days you can't. And don't wait for permission, write your own definition of success. What I learned through all these conversations is that the greatest change happens when we dare to be honest about both the hardships and the hope. I met teachers who had rebuilt their classrooms after losing everything in a fire, single mothers, learning to code late at night, first-generation college students forging new paths for their families. Their resilience reminded me that the most important thing we build isn't a product, but a belief that we all deserve a chance to try to fail, to rise, and to belong. There's a saying I keep pinned to my office wall. Success is not a destination, but a direction. The farther I walk down my own path, the more I realize that real success is about impact, integrity, and the legacy of courage we leave for those who come after us. Yes, the journey cost me more than I expected, but it also returned to me more than I ever dreamed: community purpose, and a sense of peace that no title or recognition could ever buy. The final lesson I carry forward is this: your story matters even in the moments when no one is watching. The risks you take, the boundaries you set, the ways you show up for others, they all ripple outward, changing lives in ways you may never see. So let yourself be seen. Speak up even when your voice shakes. And when you meet someone standing where you once stood, uncertain, hopeful, maybe a little bit lost, offer them your story and let it be a lamp for their path. My journey hasn't ended. It's simply changed direction. I wake up each day grateful not for the applause, but for the chance to keep building new projects, new partnerships, and above all, new beginnings for others. Because the best part of finding your way is making the road a little clearer for the next traveler. And if you're listening to this wondering if it's your turn, believe me, it is. If my story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible, overlooked, or afraid to chase the dream that keeps you up at night, I want you to know you are not alone. Your voice, your vision, and your journey matter more than you think. Maybe today is the day you take your first step, however small, toward building the life you truly want. If you found hope or courage in these words, I invite you to join this community of quiet trailblazers. Share your story in the comments or reach out to someone who's still waiting for permission to try. Let's lift each other up, celebrate our small wins, and build a world where every dream gets a chance. It's 8. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, please share this video with them. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply remind another person that their story is far from over. So what's the next step on your journey? Let us know below. Your courage might be the light someone else needs today. Subscribe for more real stories, and remember, success doesn't need permission, it just needs you.